By the spring of 1942, despite the failure of Operation Barbarossa to defeat the Soviet Union in a single campaign, the Wehrmacht had captured vast territories, including Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic republics. On the Western Front, Germany held much of Europe, the U-boat offensive was curbing American support, and in North Africa, Owen Rommel had just captured Tobruk. In the east, the Germans had stabilized a front running from Leningrad to Rostov, with several minor salients. Hitler remained confident of breaking the Red Army, despite heavy losses west of Moscow in the winter of 1941-42, because large parts of Army Group Center had been rested and re-equipped. Hitler decided that the 1942 summer campaign would target the southern Soviet Union. The initial objectives around Stalingrad were to destroy the city's industrial capacity and block the Volga River traffic, crucial for connecting the Caucasus and Caspian Sea to central Russia. The capture of Stalingrad would also disrupt Lend-Lease supplies via the Persian corridor. On the 23rd of July 1942, Hitler expanded the campaign's objectives to include occupying Stalingrad, a city with immense propaganda value, as it bore the name of the Soviet leader. Hitler ordered the annihilation of Stalingrad's population, declaring that after its capture, all male citizens would be killed and women and children deported due to their thoroughly communistic nature. The city's fall was intended to secure the northern and western flanks of the German advance on Baku to capture its petroleum resources. This expansion of objectives stemmed from German overconfidence and an underestimation of Soviet reserves.
Hier traf eine Bombe schwersten Kalibers einen Güterzug.
After delays in troop movements and logistical challenges, the Kharkov operation began on the 12th of May. The Soviets achieved initial success, prompting 6th Army Commander Friedrich Paulus to request reinforcements. However, the German counterattack on the 13th of May halted the Soviet advance. The initial advance of the 6th Army was so successful that Hitler intervened and ordered the 4th Panzer Army to join army groups south to the south. A massive roadblock resulted when the 4th Panzer and the 1st Panzer choked the roads, stopping both in their tracks while they cleared the mess of thousands of vehicles. The traffic jam is thought to have delayed the advance by at least 1 week. With the advance now slowed, Hitler changed his mind and reassigned the 4th Panzer Army back to the attack on Stalingrad. By the end of July, Soviet forces were pushed back across the Don River. At this point, the Don and Volga rivers are only 65 kilometers apart, and the Germans left their main supply depots west of the Don. The Germans began using the armies of their Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian allies to guard their left flank. Italian actions were also mentioned in official German communiques. To the south, Army Group A was pushing far into the Caucasus, but the advance slowed as supply lines grew overextended. The two German army groups were too far apart to support one another. Beginning in late August and lasting into October, the Soviets committed between 2 and 4 armies in hastily coordinated and poorly controlled attacks against the Germans' northern flank. The actions resulted in over 200,000 Soviet army casualties but did slow the German assault. The Germans formed bridgeheads across the Don on the 20th of August, with the 295th and 76th Infantry Divisions enabling the 14th Panzer Corps to thrust to the Volga north of Stalingrad. The German 6th Army was only a few dozen kilometers from Stalingrad. The 4th Panzer Army, ordered south on the 13th of July to block the Soviet retreat with the 17th Army and the 1st Panzer Army, had turned northwards alone to help take the city from the south. On the 23rd of August, the 6th Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in pursuit of the 62nd and 64th Armies, which had fallen back into the city. Stalin rushed all available troops to the east bank of the Volga, some from as far away as Siberia. Regular river ferries were quickly destroyed by the Luftwaffe. General Oberst Wolfram von Richthofen's Luftflotte dropped some 1,000 tons of bombs on the 23rd of August, with the aerial attack on Stalingrad being the most single intense aerial bombardment at that point on the Eastern Front, and the heaviest bombing raid that had ever taken place on the Eastern Front. At least 90% of the city's housing stock was obliterated as a result. The Stalingrad tractor factory continued to turn out T-34 tanks up until German troops burst into the plant.
German forces first clashed with the Stalingrad front on July 17 on the distant approaches to Stalingrad, in the bend of the Don. A significant clash in the early stages of the battle was fought at Kalik, in which the Germans had to pay a high cost in man and material. Left on the Kalisz battlefield were numerous burnt-out or shot-up German tanks. Beginning in late August and lasting into October, the Soviets committed between 2 and 4 armies in hastily coordinated and poorly controlled attacks against the Germans' northern flank. The actions resulted in over 200,000 Soviet army casualties but did slow the German assault. The Germans formed bridgeheads across the Don on August 20th, with the 295th and 76th Infantry Divisions enabling the 14th Panzer Corps to thrust to the Volga north of Stalingrad. Fourth Panzer Army, ordered south on July 13 to block the Soviet retreat with the 17th Army and the 1st Panzer Army, had turned northwards alone to help take the city from the south. Seventeenth Army and 1st Panzer Army were transferred to the new Army Group A and continued towards the Caucasus. On August 19th, German forces were in position to launch an attack on the city. On August 23rd, the 6th Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in pursuit of the 62nd and 64th Armies, which had fallen back into the city. Stalin rushed all available troops to the east bank of the Volga, some from as far away as Siberia. It has been said that Stalin prevented civilians from leaving the city in the belief that their presence would encourage greater resistance from the city's defenders. Civilians, including women and children, were put to work building trench works and protective fortifications. Casualties due to the air raid on August 23 and beyond are debated, as between the 23rd and the 26th of August. Soviet reports indicate 955 people were killed and another 1,181 wounded as a result of the bombing. The 369th Croatian Reinforced Infantry Regiment was the only non-German unit elected by the Wehrmacht to enter Stalingrad city during assault operations, with it fighting as part of the 100th Jaeger Division. Early on August 23, the German 16th Panzer and 3rd Motorized Divisions attacked out of the WWII bridgehead with a force of 120 tanks and over 200 armored personnel carriers strong. The German attack broke through the 1,382nd Rifle Regiment of the 87th Rifle Division and the 137th Tank Brigade, which were forced to retreat towards Dmitrievka. General Oberst Wolfram von Richthofen's Luftflotte 4 dropped some 1,000 tons of bombs on August 23. With the aerial attack on Stalingrad being the most single intense aerial bombardment at that point on the Eastern Front, and the heaviest bombing raid that had ever taken place on the Eastern Front. At least 90% of the city's housing stock was obliterated as a result. The Stalingrad tractor factory continued to turn out T-34 tanks up until German troops burst into the plant. Regular river ferries were quickly destroyed by the Luftwaffe. Which then targeted troop barges being towed slowly across by tugs. The 16th Panzer Division drove east towards the Volga, supported by the strikes of Henschel HS-129 ground attack aircraft. Crossing the around 1500 hours, Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz's Panzer Detachment and the Kampfgruppe of the 2nd Battalion Rheinach and Spartanovka, northern suburbs of Stalingrad. And the Stalingrad tractor factory. In the early stages of the battle, the NKVD organized poorly armed workers' militias similar to those that had defended the city 24 years earlier. Composed of civilians not directly involved in war production for immediate use in the battle. The civilians were often sent into battle without rifles. Staff and students from the local technical university. By the end of August, Army Group South had finally reached the Volga, north of Stalingrad. Another advance to the river south of the city followed, while the Soviets abandoned their Rasashka position for the inner defensive ring west of Stalingrad. The wings of the 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army met near Jablonny along the Zaritsa on September 2nd. On September 5th, the Soviet 24th and 66th Armies organized a massive attack against 14th Panzer Corps. The Luftwaffe helped repel the offensive by heavily attacking Soviet artillery positions and defensive lines. The Soviets were forced to withdraw at midday after only a few hours. Of the 120 tanks the Soviets had committed, 30 were lost to air attack. On September 13th, the battle for the city itself began. With German forces launching an attack which overran the small hill where the 62nd Soviet Army headquarters was established. In addition, the railway station was captured, and German forces advanced far enough to threaten the Volga landing stage. Soviet operations were constantly hampered by the Luftwaffe. On September 18th, the Soviet 1st Guards and 24th Army launched an offensive against 8th Army Corps at Kodlevin. After September 27th, much of the fighting in the city shifted north to the industrial district. Having slowly advanced over 10 days against strong Soviet resistance, the 51st Army Corps was finally in front of the three. Fighting raged inside the Barricadi factory until the end of October. The 16th Panzer Division referred to the Rhein-Spartanovka region as Little Verdun, because there was hardly a square meter that had not been churned up by bombs and shells. In November 1942, after 3 months of slow advance, the Germans finally reached the river banks, capturing 90% of the ruined city and splitting the remaining Soviet forces into 2 narrow pockets. Ice floes on the Volga now prevented boats and tugs from supplying the Soviet defenders. Nevertheless, the fighting continued, especially on the slopes of Mamiev Kurgan and inside the factory area in the northern part of the city. From August 21st to November 20th, the German 6th Army lost 60,548 men, including 12,782 killed, 45,545 wounded, and 2,221 missing. Fighting for the Volga banks has been noted as the most concentrated and ferocious fighting in perhaps the whole war. During the siege, the German and Allied Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian armies protecting Army Group B's north and south flanks had pressed their headquarters for support. The Hungarian Second Army was given a task of defending a 120-mile section of the front north of Stalingrad between the Italian army and Voronezh. This resulted in a very thin line, with some sectors where 1.24-mile stretches were being defended by a single platoon. These forces were also lacking in effective anti-tank weapons. Because of the total focus on the city, the Axis forces had neglected for months to consolidate their positions along the natural defensive line of the Don River. The Soviet forces were allowed to retain bridgeheads on the right bank from which offensive operations could be quickly launched. These bridgeheads in retrospect presented a serious threat to Army Group B. Similarly, on the southern flank of the Stalingrad sector, the front southwest of Kotelnikovo was held only by the Romanian army. During the siege, the German and Allied Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian armies protecting Army Group B's north and south flanks had pressed their headquarters for support. The Hungarian Second Army is given the task of defending a 120-mile section of the front north of Stalingrad between the Italian army and Voronezh. This resulted in a very thin line, with some sectors where 1.24-mile stretches were being defended by a single platoon. Similarly, on the southern flank of the Stalingrad sector, the front southwest of Kotelnikovo was held only by the Romanian army. Because of the total focus on the city, the Axis forces had neglected for months to consolidate their positions along the natural defensive line of the Don River. The Soviet forces were allowed to retain bridgeheads on the right bank from which offensive operations could be quickly launched. These bridgeheads in retrospect presented a serious threat to Army Group B. It took a few more days for them to prepare for the most savage offensive of all, which was unleashed on October 14th, which Chukov considered to be the worst day of the battle. Exceptionally intense shelling and bombing paved the way for the first German assault groups. The main attack, led by the 14th Panzer and 305th Infantry Divisions, attacked towards the tractor factory, while another assault led by the 24th Panzer Division hit to the south of the giant plant. The German onslaught crushed the 37th Guards Rifle Division of Major General Viktor Zaludev, and in the afternoon the forward assault group reached the tractor factory. Fighting raged inside the Barikadi factory until the end of October. In the north of Stalingrad, by early November, the 16th Panzer Division referred to the Rhenex-Bardenovka region as Little Verdun because there was hardly a square meter that had not been churned up by bombs and shells. In November 1942, after 3 months of slow advance, the Germans finally reached the river banks, capturing 90% of the ruined city and splitting the remaining Soviet forces into two narrow pockets. Ice floes on the Volga now prevented boats and tugs from supplying the Soviet defenders. Nevertheless, the fighting continued, especially on the slopes of Mamiev Kurgan and inside the factory area in the northern part of the city. From August 21st to November 20th, the German 6th Army lost 60,548 men. Including 12,782 killed. $45,545 wounded and 2,221 missing. Fighting for the Volga banks has been noted as the most concentrated and ferocious fighting in perhaps the whole war. Paulus had requested permission on November 10th to withdraw the 6th Army behind the Don, but was rejected. According to Paulus's comments to his adjutant Wilhelm Adam, there is still the order whereby no commander of an army group or an army has the right to relinquish a village, even a trench, without Hitler's consent. By the time of the encirclement, approximately 330,000 Axis personnel, including Germans, Romanians, Italians, and Croatians, were trapped. Among them were between 40,000 and 65,000 volunteer auxiliaries, recruited from Soviet POWs and civilians. These highway often served in supporting roles but were also deployed in frontline units due to their growing numbers. The conditions within the German 6th Army deteriorated to those reminiscent of World War I trench warfare. Troops were forced to take up positions in the open steppe. lacking basic sanitation, which led to rapid spread of infections and dysentery, further debilitating the soldiers. By November 19, 1942, the German forces in the pocket numbered about 210,000. With 50,000 soldiers outside the encirclement. Of those trapped, 10,000 continued to fight. $105,000 eventually surrendered, 35,000 were evacuated by air, and 60,000 died. Despite the 6th Army's dire situation, no reinforcements were pulled from Army Group A in the Caucasus to aid in the relief of Stalingrad. It was only after Soviet forces broke through in Operation Little Saturn, threatening to encircle Army Group A, that a withdrawal was ordered on December 31st to avoid complete entrapment. Army Group Dawn was established under Field Marshal von Manstein, tasked with leading the 20 German and 2 Romanian divisions encircled at Stalingrad. Despite Manstein's recommendation for a breakout, Hitler insisted on holding the city, relying on an ill-fated airlift to supply the 6th Army, which failed to deliver the necessary supplies. The airlift fell drastically short, delivering only 105 tons per day, far below the required 750 tons. The situation worsened after the Soviets captured Tatsinskaya airfield on December 24th, forcing the Germans to relocate their air operations to more distant and less effective bases. As supplies dwindled, starvation and disease ravaged the 6th Army. By the time the airlift was terminated, the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 500 aircraft. And failed to maintain adequate supply levels. Ultimately, the failure to relieve Stalingrad sealed the fate of the 6th Army, leading to one of the most catastrophic defeats in military history. Manstein's plan to rescue the 6th Army, Operation Winter Storm, was developed in full consultation with Führer headquarters. It aimed to break through to the 6th Army and establish a corridor to keep it supplied and reinforced, so that, according to Hitler's order, it could maintain its cornerstone position on the Volga with regard to operations in 1943. Manstein, however, who knew that 6th Army could not survive the winter there, instructed his headquarters to draw up a further plan in the event of Hitler seeing sense. This would include the subsequent breakout of 6th Army. in the event of a successful first phase, and its physical reincorporation in Army Group Dawn. This second plan was given the name Operation Thunderclap. Winter Storm, as Zhukov had predicted, was originally planned as a two-pronged attack. One thrust would come from the area of Kotelnikovo, well to the south, and around 100 miles from the 6th Army. The other would start from the Chur front west of the Don. Which was little more than 40 miles from the edge of the Kessel. The continuing attacks of Romanenko's 5th Tank Army against the German detachments along the river Chur ruled out that start line. This left only the 57th Panzer Corps around Kotelnikovo, supported by the rest of Hoth's very mixed 4th Panzer Army, to relieve Paulus's trapped divisions. The 57th Panzer Corps, commanded by General Friedrich Kirchner, had been weak at first. It consisted of 2 Romanian cavalry divisions and the 23rd Panzer Division, which mustered no more than 30 serviceable tanks. The 6th Panzer Division, arriving from France, was a vastly more powerful formation, but its members hardly received an encouraging impression. The Austrian divisional commander, General Erhard Raus, was summoned to Manstein's royal carriage in Kharkov station on November 24th, where the field marshal briefed him. He described the situation in very somber terms, recorded Raus. By December 18th, the German army had pushed to within 30 miles of 6th Army's positions. However, the predictable nature of the relief operation brought significant risk for all German forces in the area. The starving encircled forces at Stalingrad made no attempt to break out or link up with Manstein's advance.